Good evening. A scramble to sell leads the news this Friday. Wall Street's closely watched Dow Jones average tumbled more than 120 points in heavy trading. In other news, the Iran-Contra conviction of John Poindexter was overturned, and former State Department official Elliott Abrams was given probation for his part in the scandal. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. Judy Woodruff's in Washington tonight. Judy?
On the NewsHour tonight, a city under siege is our main story. We have a documentary report from journalist Paul Davies, who has spent the week in Dubrovnik in the embattled Yugoslav Republic of Croatia. Then, tomorrow's Louisiana showdown between David Duke and Edwin Edwards. Betty Ann Bowser reports on where the campaign stands, followed by two columnists well steeped in Louisiana politics. Finally, some words on that and other developments of the week from our regular political analysis team of Gergen and Shields.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo.
Every day we enjoy people being cold to us, cutting us up, getting fresh with us, tearing into us, and calling us chicken. In fact, the more people do it, the happier we are. PepsiCo.
And by AT&T. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
The stock market registered its fifth biggest drop ever today, reflecting doubts on Wall Street about the economy's ability to break free from the recession. The late afternoon sell-off ended with the Dow Jones Industrial Average down more than 120 points, closing at 2943.20. Volume was a heavy 236 million shares, and the losses were broad-based. Analysts said computer-driven sell orders, concerns over a flurry of negative economic reports, and poor corporate earnings all contributed to the run on the market. Earlier in the day, President Bush told a group of business leaders he was concerned about the nation's economic growth, which he described as anemic and slow, but he said he saw some encouraging signs. Mr. Bush spoke to the group via satellite from Washington.
There's some tough economic statistics out there, but right now, inflation is under control. That's one stealth tax that people don't have to worry about. Interest rates are lower now than they've been in years. And earlier this week, I called for lower credit card rates to take some of the sting out of consumer debt. And I'm pleased to see some banks responding. And frankly, I hope more will follow suit. Revive consumer confidence. Give this economy a little kick.
White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater said that while President Bush would like to see lower interest rates on credit cards, he opposes congressional efforts to set legal limits. He said artificial constraints could be quite disastrous to the banking industry. A compromise bill to extend unemployment benefits threatened to delay passage of the legislation unless some states received more benefits. A compromise was worked out this evening in which each state would get a minimum of 13 weeks of extra benefits. Benefits ran into opposition in the Senate because the bill provided up to 20 weeks of additional benefits to individuals who exhaust the basic 26 weeks of coverage, but the amount of extra benefits depended on the unemployment rate in a particular state. Judy?
The Iran-Contra conviction of former National Security Advisor John Poindexter was reversed today. In a 2-1 decision, the Federal Appeals Court in Washington said independent prosecutor Lawrence Walsh had failed to prove that Poindexter's testimony to Congress in 1987, given under a grant of immunity from prosecution, had not been used against him at trial. The ruling was nearly identical to one that dismissed charges against former White House aide Oliver North. Poindexter had been convicted of lying to Congress. Also today, former Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams was sentenced to 2 years probation and 100 hours of community service for his role in the Iran-Contra affair. Last month, Abrams admitted he misled Congress about the diversion of funds to the Nicaraguan Contras. He has agreed to cooperate with Iran-Contra investigators.
A federal grand jury in Washington handed up indictments today against the scandal-ridden Bank of Credit and Commerce International and 3 men associated with it. They're charged with the illegal takeover of the Independence Bank of Encino, California in 1985. Other charges involve fraudulent stock dealings related to a Miami, Florida savings bank. The men named in the indictment are BCCI's founder, Aga Hassan Abedi, the bank's chief operating officer, Swale Naqvi, and Saudi investor Gaith Faron. The Senate Judiciary Committee today voted to recommend confirmation of William Barr to be Attorney General. The vote was unanimous. Barr has been acting Attorney General since Dick Thornburgh left the job in August to run unsuccessfully for the Senate. Quick approval of the Barr nomination by the full Senate is expected.
Yet another ceasefire was agreed to in Yugoslavia today, the 13th since fighting broke out in the breakaway Croatian Republic more than 4 months ago. That fighting continued to rage today. After pounding Dubrovnik for days, the Federal Navy turned its guns on the port of Split. Also in the besieged town of Vukovar, correspondent David Chater from Britain's independent television news was hit by gunfire. We have 2 reports from independent television news, beginning with Norman Rees in the port of Split.
It was a surprise attack. Yugoslav Navy warships began shelling Split just after dawn while most of the town was sleeping. The targets appeared indiscriminate, the apparent objective to terrorize the residents. From this hilltop under their flag, the Croatians returned fire. They were close enough to force this warship to take evasive action. With battle now joined, the warning siren sent people sprinting for the shelters. These people have seen what's happened to Dubrovnik. Now they fear it may be their turn. For 2 hours, the bombardment of Split continued. As the defenders stepped up the counterattack, the 2 warships finally gave up and steamed away.
The battle for Vukovar has raged for almost 3 months. The civilian population live underground. Anyone above ground is considered a fighter and a target. The Federal Army's tanks, rifle grenades against the lone gunman. The graveyard marks the city's front line. The Federal Army moved forward. Neither side is prepared to reveal its death toll. There could be as many as 3,000 defenders, but the town will not fall until the last one has left or been killed. David Chater was with a Serbian marksman when he and his camera crew came under fire.
Got our range, haven't
The sniper in a church across the road. David was hit in the back. The Federal Army moved in. David was fully conscious. Then the dangerous journey to a waiting helicopter, and from there to the military hospital in Belgrade.
This evening, Chater was reported in serious but not critical condition.
Israeli police today recommended that Palestinian Hanan Ashrawi be put on trial for allegedly meeting with the PLO. Israel has outlawed meetings with the terrorist groups, and it considers the PLO such an organization. Ashrawi was the spokeswoman for Palestinians at the Middle East Peace Conference in Madrid. She called the police recommendation petty and vindictive. Jordan's foreign minister said the move was an Israeli attempt to derail Mideast peace talks. In Washington, the State Department expressed concern about the action, and President Bush said he was paying close attention to the case. Palestinians in the occupied territories today marked their self-declared Independence Day with marches. Most of the demonstrations were peaceful, but a Palestinian in Arab East Jerusalem was killed by police after painting nationalist slogans near the home of Israeli Housing Minister Ariel Sharon. And in South Lebanon, Israeli troops shelled Shiite Muslim villages, reportedly killing 3 children. The attacks came in apparent response to a bomb attack against Israel last night.
Human rights was among a broad range of issues discussed by Secretary of State Baker and Chinese officials in Beijing today. Baker reportedly pressed the officials on political prisoners and other human rights concerns. The U.S. has given China a list of 800 political prisoners and asked that they be freed. The talks also focused on trade and nuclear proliferation, among other issues. Baker's visit was the first by a senior U.S. official since the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown.
Former basketball star Magic Johnson today accepted President Bush's offer to serve on the National Commission on AIDS. He said he hoped to focus attention on what everyone must do to fight the disease. Last week, Johnson announced he was infected with the HIV virus. That's it for the news summary. Now it's on to the assault on Dubrovnik, the face-off in Louisiana, and Gergen and Shields.
We begin tonight with a report on the beleaguered city of Dubrovnik, Yugoslavia. The reporter is Paul Davies of Independent Television News, who is the only Western reporter left in Dubrovnik. Situated on the Adriatic coast of Croatia, it has been under siege by the Yugoslav Federal Army, which is dominated by Serbians trying to suppress Croatian independence. For the past 5 days, correspondent Davies has witnessed the Army's assault on Dubrovnik. Yesterday, he managed to smuggle out the pictures his crew has been recording, along with this report on what the city has been through.
It was early Saturday morning when the battle for Dubrovnik intensified. Tanks and heavy guns of the Serbian-dominated Federal Army pouring in fire from their positions in the surrounding mountains. The majority of the city's population took to the underground shelters. But those who ventured outside witnessed a coordinated land, sea and air attack on their city. Once again, the main target for the Federal Army guns was the Napoleonic fort on Mount Serge above Dubrovnik, the Croatian defenders' most vital position. Federal Navy ships appeared offshore to join the attack. It was not a totally one-sided exchange. Here, mortars fired out from the city, falling just short of Federal gun batteries hidden in trees on top of Mount Jakovica. But the Federal forces were able to use helicopters to spot targets for their superior firepower. Dubrovnik under fire from the sea and from the air. MiG jets now trying to knock the Croatians from their perch on top of Mount Serge. The bombs fell wide of their target. The fort, still intact, opened up with anti-aircraft fire. There was a notable success for the Croatian defenders when their guns hit the nearest Federal artillery battery on Mount Jakovica, igniting an ammunition dump. But their celebrations were cut short as stray bullets ricocheted around the ramparts of the old city. Shells falling into Dubrovnik's main harbour hit one of the ferries that had been unable to leave port because of the naval blockade. It was now impossible for the thousands trapped here to escape the bombardment.
Threats of sanctions have made no difference to the Federal Army. If anything, the fighting has escalated since the latest European Community ultimatum.
In Dubrovnik Hospital, most of the casualties were suffering from wounds caused by flying shrapnel. Doctors say more than half the victims treated here have been civilians. The gunboats appeared to have targeted a Croatian gun post alongside the seafront Belvedere Hotel. The hotel, which had been a home for hundreds of refugees, was all but destroyed by the shelling. Saturday ended as it had begun, with the sound of artillery fire echoing around the old city. Sunday morning in Dubrovnik's Gothic cathedral, they prayed for peace. For many of the congregation, this was the first time in days they dared to venture out of the bomb shelters. But outside, no respite from the bombardment. Indeed, the cross on top of Mount Serge almost toppled by an exploding shell. Federal Navy frigates appeared off the old city, firing at will, safely out of range of the defenders' smaller guns. For hours, shells rained on Mount Serge and its battered fort. But some fell short, and others dropped into the old city itself. Until now, the Federal forces have concentrated their attack on areas outside the old city, but now their mortars are falling inside the ancient walls. One exploded through the roof of a house built 4 centuries ago. In all, 4 mortars fell inside the city walls that day, shrapnel exploding into the convent. The tranquility of the 14th century Franciscan monastery, home of Europe's oldest apothecary, was also shattered. As Friar Josu Sopter tried to tell us about the damage to the monastery, his words were drowned by another attack.
Tužno. Sad.
As the federal troops closed in, the few residents left on the streets took what cover they could. This woman had risked her life to rescue her dog from its kennel in the old harbour. A day that started with prayer ended with pitched battles in the hilltops. Monday and the famous Straden, Dubrovnik's main street, deserted in preparation for the inevitable resumption of this one-sided battle. Residential areas devastated, with shells falling closer and closer to the old city. For the first time, striking its medieval walls. Down the centuries, Dubrovnik's citizens have defied would-be invaders. Now their old ramparts face 20th century war machines. But at least the walls offered some protection. Outside, there was no escape. The Grand Hotel, probably Dubrovnik's finest, ablaze. But this was just a foretaste of the destruction that was to follow as the federal forces closed in. Tuesday morning, and the attack everyone had feared, but most secretly believed could never happen. A deliberate and sustained assault on the old city. This was not a case of shells going astray. It was a calculated decision to irreparably damage a city that is in its entirety a protected monument. Some shells appeared to bounce off the 100-foot-high walls, but others crashed into the city. The Federal Army was now using Soviet-made wire-guided missiles against walls first built to keep out arrows and spears. Missiles landing in the old port set boats and buildings ablaze. Among the witnesses to the attack was Britain's consul to Dubrovnik, Sarah Maraika, whose husband is Croatian.
Nobody ever thought that the old city would be damaged. It's the same way that one thinks of Venice or Rome or Paris or Canterbury. I think everyone thought the old city was inviolate, and now it's been proved that that isn't either. You know, this was built as a siege town.
That's 5 shells.
5 shells.
5 shells as we've been talking.
As we've been talking. And that's quite minimal, isn't it, compared to what we have gone through earlier today.
From the terrace of the Hotel Argentina, the European community observers also watched the destruction, powerless to intervene.
They're shooting for the tower in the old city. Yeah. They just missed it.
Yeah. But they were forced to run for shelter when mortars fell around their hotel. The observers spent hours pinned down by mortars exploding outside. Plans to evacuate their team by sea had to be postponed because of the raging battle. In the hotel bar, scenes reminiscent of London's East End during the Blitz. The locals singing traditional songs to drown the noise of the guns. Britain's consul joining in this attempt to keep up spirits in spite of everything. But a few hundred yards away, the destruction continued, hour after hour. When the Serbian-led federal forces first laid siege to Dubrovnik 6 weeks ago, they warned the Croatian garrison surrender or face the consequences. Few people in the world could have realized that this was what they meant by consequences. The city they called the Pearl of the Adriatic. Its history and its beauty attracted tourists from around the world. Now its ancient structures lit up by flames as its citizens await the next onslaught. Wednesday and Thursday the fires still burnt, but at least a respite from the fighting. Only now there was another agony. A ceasefire brokered by the EC observers allowed the evacuation of women, children, and the wounded, but only 1,600 could go. On the dockside they queued, waiting to discover who would be allowed to board the ferry and who had to stay. Families separated, no way of knowing when they would see their homes again, or how many of the husbands and sons left behind would survive.
Tomorrow's gubernatorial runoff election in Louisiana is our main focus tonight. Voters will be choosing between former Democratic Governor Edwin Edwards, who has been tried and acquitted twice on racketeering and mail fraud charges, and David Duke, a Republican and a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi sympathizer. Polls this week show Edwards leading, but even the pollsters agree with Duke's own assessment that he flies under radar. Before our analysis, this report from correspondent Betty Ann Bowser of public station KUHT, Houston.
This is 41-year-old David Duke, who may be elected the next governor of the state of Louisiana. And this is David Duke at the age of 17 when he proclaimed himself a Nazi sympathizer and demonstrated with a swastika on his armband.
We're going to get to the point where the white people in this country are going to be masters of their own destiny again.
And Duke in the 1970s, when he was elected Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, going about the country preaching superiority of the white race. This is David Duke today. He looks and sounds different. His once brown hair is blonde. His broad nose is thinner, reportedly the result of plastic surgery. But that's not all that's changed. Duke says what's inside has undergone a transformation.
Well, you know, I've said that I was too intolerant, and there's no question that I was, and I have regrets about that in my life. But I live in the present and the future, and I am a Christian.
Born again?
Yes, I am a born-again Christian, and I accept Christ. In fact, the last 2 years I've had a lot of attacks on my character, and if not for my relationship with Christ, I wouldn't be able to be here today.
Duke's current message is aimed at white middle-class voters. He wants to clean up the welfare system, and he's opposed to affirmative action, set-asides, and forced busing.
What hurts us is the crime rate we have. It's our educational problems. What hurts us is the welfare state that we're creating here, the drug problems that we have in the state of Louisiana. That's what hurts us.
Susan Howell is a political scientist at the University of New Orleans who has been following Duke's career.
We can't stereotype Duke supporters. He got 56% of the white vote in the Senate race. In this last primary, he got 42% of the white vote. That's a lot of different types of people.
Howell says most Duke supporters do not see themselves as racists, but her research shows the emergence of a new form of anti-black sentiment.
What is happening today is that there is a belief in a stereotype of black people as not living up to the American work ethic ideals, that they are getting favors from government simply because they're black, and that the legal barriers have been removed. Now it's time for blacks to join the American mainstream.
Louisiana has been out of the economic mainstream since the mid-1980s, when the oil industry went bust. The state has been unable to diversify its economy and lessen dependence on oil and gas. So today, Louisianans have the lowest annual income in the country, the highest illiteracy rate, and some of the worst pollution problems anywhere. Chemical workers along the Mississippi from New Orleans to Baton Rouge have lived through these hard economic times, and many of them feel they have also suffered because of affirmative action. Carol Comber is a Duke supporter.
If I had a son that went to apply for a job at one of these plants, because he's a white male, he would have to make a higher score to get considered for a job, whereas a member of a minority group could go and make a much lower score and get hired. And I just feel that really and truly the best qualified person should get a job.
How could David Duke change that?
I don't know that he can change it, but I think that he would probably bring it to the attention of the rest of the country and many people in the state. I really don't know that, honestly, he could change it. But at least he is sort of a person that understands what we're going through.
People like Harold Comber were once the core of Duke's support, but political scientist Susan Howell says recent polling shows something new.
Duke appeals to a broad cross-section of white voters. He used to be kind of a blue-collar phenomenon, but he has crossed the high school diploma line, and he does get support from educated white voters.
Ron Courtade is a young attorney who's voting for Duke. He invited some other supporters over to his New Orleans home for coffee to explain Duke's appeal. Among the group were a political science teacher, a businessman, and a former executive secretary to 3 Tulane University presidents.
I think David Duke is extremely in line with the philosophy of Ronald Reagan and George Bush.
I'm a conservative, and my parents were Republicans back when it was not fashionable to be a Republican in Louisiana.
You are, and you tell me if I'm wrong or not, one of the main reasons you're supporting David Duke is he's a Republican, and he is espousing Republican Party politics. Mm-hmm. You're, in a sense, almost toting the party line here. Do you feel that you are, Betsy?
Absolutely, yes.
Being a loyal Republican?
Yes.
In spite of the fact that the President of the United States says this man...
No, I think he did a terrible thing by urging Republicans to vote for a liberal Democrat. It would be like telling people to vote for Michael Dukakis.
It is ironical that he tells the people of Louisiana to vote for a liberal Democrat when he has spent the last week bashing the Democrats in Washington and blaming all the ills of the country on the Democrats. I mean, how can you explain that?
I think there has been a disproportionate amount of time spent in this entire election on David Duke's past. I cannot recall the last time a person in a hood or wearing a swastika killed, mugged, robbed, or raped somebody. The people who are committing the heinous crimes are not wearing hoods and not wearing swastikas. They're local thugs who are high school dropouts and drug dependent more times than not. And those folks are the ones who I fear when I go someplace in the inner city of New Orleans, not people wearing hoods and swastikas.
I don't think we have to fear David Duke's past. I think we have to fear our present and the horrendous problems that all the big cities face in this country. And that is our greatest fear, and I think that's what we should address, because that is the present, and that's the time in which we live, and I don't think we should worry about anyone's past, because people do change. They're changing all the time.
As Duke's appeal spreads to a larger segment of Louisiana voters, some people are asking the question, has he changed? Political scientist Richard Murray, a Louisiana native, says no.
Lyndon Johnson was sort of right when he went to New Orleans 1964 and said, the old days when you could campaign saying nigger, nigger, nigger over. Duke doesn't say that. But he's found out that you don't have to. You can say welfare mothers, the underclass, talk about the spiraling crime wave, talk about people that get jobs that they don't deserve because government is intervening, and everybody gets the message. Those are mostly black folks you're talking about.
Former three-term Democratic Governor Edwin Edwards is the other candidate in the race.
He uses euphemisms, but they know what he's saying, and they understand his message, and his message is infected by the messenger.
Edwards says he's the candidate who's changed, given up gambling once and for all, and is trying to change his reputation as a womanizer.
Well, I'll certainly say that I'm going to discontinue this frivolous attitude I've had about womanizing. The thing is, I just laughed and joked about that because so many people said it, didn't know what they were talking about. But I'm 64 years old now, and I want this opportunity to do something for myself and for my state, and I'm not going to blow it.
Edwards says he wants to leave a positive legacy, to clean up the environment, to bring business back to the state. And he says Duke would be a disaster for Louisiana.
He is playing on their fears and frustrations, anger and resentment, and anytime you play to the darker side of human beings, it becomes very intense. And I understand that we have serious problems in Louisiana, and he's good at articulating the problems. He's yet to come up with a solution.
Edwards' strongest support comes from the black community. In the days following the primary, more than 60,000 people registered to vote, many because they opposed David Duke. Students at Southern University in Baton Rouge made this video as half the students living on campus signed up. Tricia Heatley was one of them.
I wasn't really serious about voting. One less vote, you know, it's not gonna matter. And I was shocked into reality. You know, everybody's heard about his background, and I was really afraid, you know. And I was just like, man, you know, every vote really did count.
Edwards also has strong support among business leaders, whom Baton Rouge reporter Kelly King-Alexander recently surveyed.
New Orleans is a big tourism city. It gets about $1 billion worth of economic impact per year. And Convention and Visitors Bureau in New Orleans and also locally here in Baton Rouge are really worried about what the election of David Duke would do to the state in terms of sending a message out. And they do not believe conventions and business groups will continue to meet here.
But some voters don't like either candidate. Edwards has been indicted twice on federal racketeering charges, and although he's never been convicted, the accusations are worrisome for some people. Incumbent Republican Governor Buddy Roemer, who was odd man out in the primary, agonized over who to vote for.
I care too about you. That's why I'm making a public disclosure of a private decision. I will vote for Edwin Edwards for governor. I cannot, will not, must not vote for David Duke. It would be suicide for Louisiana. And since my choices are only two, Edwards gets my vote. He does not get my endorsement.
Melanie O'Neill is a Roemer voter from Morgan City who is concerned about cancers that may be tied to a waste treatment plant built during the Edwards years. She says she loathes both candidates but feels she must vote.
I cannot vote for David Duke. I mean, the idea is appalling to me. I feel like my father fought, you know, Nazis in World War II. There's no way I could vote for someone like that to be governor of this state. At least I feel with Edwin Edwards, there's somebody there who knows how to do the business of the state. It's like corruption I know or a Nazi I don't know.
Which is worse?
At least the corruption, we're all going to be out there watching Edwin, you know? With David Duke, it's too unknown. We don't know what we get.
Ann Guarisco is a neighbor who shares O'Neill's environmental concerns, but she has different plans.
I voted for Roemer, but I'm going to vote for David Duke now. Not because I like him. I think it would be easier to do a recall on David Duke and get him out than it would be on Edwin Edwards. And that's the only reason I'm voting for David Duke.
Here you go. Recall whoever wins.
Whoever wins the governor's race will find Baton Rouge attorney Ted Shermer waiting in the wings, organizing a drive to recall the victor.
I'm not going to vote for either one of the individuals because I hold my vote too sacred to give it to them. The recall is the purest form of the democratic process. It is the citizens asking a public official who is already elected to come forward for a vote of confidence, one way or the other. And for these two individuals, whichever one wins, they're going to need that vote of confidence.
Whether Duke wins or loses, it seems clear he will remain active in Republican Party politics. Again, political scientist Richard Murray.
The problem with Duke is he never stops. He runs continuously. Either he wins this race, which is perhaps not likely, but possible, and is the governor of a southern state, a Republican governor, who's going to be front and center because he gets enormous media play, or he runs a good but losing race, and what does he do? Well, he might decide to do what George Wallace did in 1964, enter a few presidential primaries as a Republican, pick up protest votes against George Bush, particularly if the economy's lousy next spring. You know, this guy, his life is campaigning. He's been a political junkie since he was a teenager, and he's not going to stop.
The contest between Duke and Edwards is also being fought on the airwaves in Louisiana. As one state Democratic Party leader put it, anyone with 3 red cents has been buying airtime. Here's a sample of the messages Louisiana voters have been hearing this past week.
The interview you are about to hear was recorded on February 17, 1986. The voices are those of David Duke and Joe Fields, a California neo-Nazi.
Maybe I wouldn't go out and say, hey, I'm a Nazi, you know, but I'd never deny it.
I way out of it, see, because I'm a pragmatist.
You know, Hitler started with, he had 7 men.
Don't you think it can happen right now, put the right package together?
Most people aren't ever going to come over until things get tough.
That's a very defeatist philosophy. This government, it may take decades to bring this government down. Have you ever heard such weeping and gnashing of teeth? The news media have given up any pretense of fair play. The liberals have gone ballistic. The special interests have gone mad. The politicians who play to them are lining up on cue. Principles lie abandoned. Hypocrisy rules the day. I raise issues that must be discussed and get back venom instead. Try a little experiment. Next time you hear someone accuse me of intolerance and hatred, notice who's doing the shouting.
Now we look at the governor's race with 2 observers in Louisiana. In New Orleans, syndicated columnist John McGinnis is writing a book on this election, and Larry English, a columnist with the Shreveport, Louisiana Journal and a law student at Tulane University. Mr. McGinnis, what do you expect to happen tomorrow?
Well, right now I feel it could be close, but I think that Edwards has control of this election and is going to come out the winner. I think there's going to be a massive turnout, both among black and white voters. It might be a record turnout in the state, over 80% of the registered voters, perhaps.
Mr. English, do you agree with that, an Edwards victory?
Well, my heart is telling me that Edwin Edwards will probably win the vote, probably around 52%, but I've learned, like most people here in Louisiana, not to underestimate David Duke. And I certainly have some concern as to whether or not how accurate the polls are right now that we're seeing.
Are you one of those who believes that the Duke vote is hidden, that some white people don't want to admit they're voting for Duke, that he flies under the radar, as he says himself?
Well, every election that David Duke has been in here in Louisiana, that has been the case. He's always polled significantly lower than the turnout that he receives on election day. So I think that certainly has me concerned as well as other people here in Louisiana.
How big a factor is that, Mr. McGinnis, do you think?
Well, even in the polls you're seeing now, they have to adjust them for the hidden Duke votes. They're playing voodoo with it anyway, but it's as much as, you know, from the raw vote, they've adjusted Duke up 10 or 12 points. And, you know, I think that the people outright deceive pollsters, which I think is kind of a healthy idea. You know, I think the pollsters almost think that there's not a right to the secret ballot. They're very upset of the idea of people lying to them. But I think obviously in the primary, there were many people saying they were voting for Romer who went out and voted for Duke.
Is, Mr. McGinnis, if Duke loses, is it because voters have been scared off because of all the past associations with Duke, the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazis, and all that sort of thing, or because he'd just be very bad for the economy, as Edwards has been saying?
Well, I don't think Duke is going to lose any of the voters he's already votes he's already received. I think that the ads and the idea of the losing business in Louisiana is preventing him from really penetrating deeply into the middle class. He was, I think, making some real inroads in there after the primary, but the reality is beginning to settle in on people that, you know, Louisiana could be blackballed, and that's not going to help us regardless of, you know, even if David Duke does try to be a better governor, Louisiana's not going to have a chance.
Apparently, his prominence in this election has really galvanized the black voters, Mr. English. What if he does not win? What do you think is going to be the decisive factor?
I think it's going to be several things. I think certainly you're going to see a higher black turnout. Probably we're going to break a record here. I'm looking for somewhere between 75 to 85%. I think also here in New Orleans, certainly the way the business community has come out in force, indicating that the local economy here in New Orleans would be devastated, and that would certainly have an impact across the state, because New Orleans is certainly the most viable economic area here in the state of Louisiana. I think that those voters who might be on the fence, Roma voters, and were somewhat undecided about whether or not voting for David Duke in this election, I think that's where you might see David Duke not be able to pick up those votes as a result. Those people may vote self-interest, as most voters do, and that they're going to probably vote for Edwin Edwards out of a self-interest because they're the things that they like about Duke's program may not outweigh their fear of what will happen if he's elected governor.
Mr. McGinnis, let's tackle this difficult question of what is racism in Duke's appeal? What is naked appeal to race? And what is to distinguish it, a respectable raising of issues that many Republicans and others raise, and people like Clarence Thomas raise, for example, questioning of affirmative action. How do you, having looked at the Duke support, how do you pull those two strands apart? The sort of what might be called in the national scene the respectable nature of the appeal and the part that nobody wants to associate himself with.
Well, I think that the racist part is enclosed inside of the respectable part. I mean, I think there are people who are voting for Duke for both reasons. One, they don't like black people. They think that they're getting too much. And then beyond that, they respond to the same message that Ronald Reagan and George Bush have raised. So I think one is sort of enclosed within the other. I really feel like maybe like 1/3 or maybe as much as 40% of Duke's support is really hardcore people who just don't like blacks, and a guy like Duke appeals to them. But the rest is a strong conservative vote. And we don't really know what David Duke's real base is because so far he's run against two fairly unpopular Democrats, and a lot of it is a protest vote against the status quo.
Yeah. Mr. English, the South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu is visiting the States. He was in South Carolina today, and he said Duke is making racism respectable. Now, is that a fair comment viewed from Louisiana?
I think certainly it's a fair comment, but I think that Ronald Reagan, during his 8 years of presidency, helped lay the foundation. I think what David Duke has done is that he seized up on an environment that has been created in this country that has come from the Republican administration over the last 10 years. Ronald Reagan, in many ways, used a lot of the same code words that David Duke is using. So I find it somewhat disingenuous when the Republican Party now tries to separate themselves from them. To say that David Duke is making racism respectable, I think is to say that maybe David Duke has created David Duke. And I think that David Duke has seized up on an environment that was laid there before he came on certainly the mainstream political scene. So I think that you have to look at the history of this country, and particularly you have to look at the way politicians have openly used the racism issue and the fear that results from it over the last 10 years.
Yeah. Mr. McGinnis, you heard our piece by Betty Ann Bowser, that group of people who are Duke supporters, rationalizing their support as mainstream republicanism. Do you run into a lot of Republicans who feel that way, that they're just doing what is has been the main message of the party, and that Bush has just now walked away from it?
Well, I'm running into, I think most of the people that I talk to at Duke rallies are George Wallace type Democrats instead of being Republicans. I think a lot of the Republicans voted for someone else in the primary, Buddy Roemer or Clyde Holloway, and they're reluctantly coming to Duke. But and they're only doing so because I think they really don't want to vote for Edwin Edwards, and they begrudgingly, and also a lot of them feel like the Democrats have controlled this state, and a vote for Duke would just be a vote to shake things up. Mm-hmm. I'm also running into a lot of people at these rallies, Democrats and Republicans alike, who have no use for George Bush anymore, and I've heard many of them say they'll never vote for him again. Many of them are very upset that he came out and spoke against David Duke.
Uh-huh. It comes to the question of what happens if Duke does lose. Do you think, Mr. McGinnis, that he's a perpetual campaigner and he'll be back as a presidential candidate or a senatorial candidate?
Sure, it beats working. I think he'll run again. I mean, his greatest gift and what he's done for most of his adult life is raise money through his mailing list, and I think that this campaign has increased his fundraising capability. I think he's the best grassroots fundraiser since Jimmy Swaggart. And he'll just he's used this platform, and I think he'll go national. Over about half of his donors in this race live out of state. So I think he's going to look to, I could see him entering some presidential primaries if he loses. I could see him going so far as in 92 or maybe 96, forming a third party and running in the general election for president. I think if he did that, he'd be a terrible threat to the Republican Party.
We have to go to Washington now, but just before we do, neither of you is absolutely sure in saying that Edwards will win and Duke will be defeated tomorrow. Am I right?
No, certainly I'm not. I wish I was at this particular point, and I hope that I would be, but I am concerned very much that David Duke may indeed be the next governor of Louisiana.
And Mr. McGinnis?
I feel a little more confident. I think Edwin is going to win. I've got a bet with one of his bodyguards. He's betting there'll be over 55%. I say under 55%, but okay. I think Edwards is close to having it.
Well, John McGinnis and Larry English, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Judy?
Now for some national perspective on the Louisiana governor's race, along with analysis of the political week that was. We turn to Gergen and Shields. David Gergen is editor-at-large for U.S. News and World Report. Mark Shields is a syndicated columnist. David, whatever happens with David Duke tomorrow, why has he gotten as far as he has gotten? What is it about him, do you think?
Well, Louisiana has been in terrible shape for a number of years. There are a lot of people hurting, and there are a lot of people very angry. We see in Louisiana what we've seen around the rest of the country, and that is a frustration, a sense that things are out of control, and David Duke is a voice of protest to them. He also, obviously, is appealing to racial prejudice and a belief, a growing belief, and I think something we have to be concerned about in the rest of the country. There is a white backlash in this country now. There is a feeling among a lot of whites who are hurting that somehow they're hurting because the national government or the government has given preferences to minorities, especially to blacks.
So, Mark, if he could do well in Louisiana, again, win or lose tomorrow, he could do well in other states, in other places?
I think that's a possibility, Judy. I don't think it's limited to Louisiana. I think David's absolutely right. That has to be underlined, that Louisiana has never come out of the recession. I mean, the oil downturn, the recession of '82. So hard times breed. Breed the kind of ground in which a David Duke movement can really grow, where cries and charges of preferential treatment, special privilege, have a resonance. That combination of social dynamite is quite explosive in that sort of a situation. His appeal is not strictly racial by any means. It's endemic to the nation. It's a remoteness of government leadership, an unresponsiveness, and in many senses, a corruption.
Just the kind of things that David Matthews and others have been talking about on your program this week. This is a reflection of that.
A series of conversations we've had on what's wrong with the political.
Yes.
How much of a headache has he already been for the Republican Party, David?
Well, he's an enormous headache, and the Republicans in some ways are now in a no-win situation. If David Duke wins, he becomes an albatross for the Republican Party. He shows up at Houston at the convention as a Republican governor. He tries to go to the Governors Association. He, in effect, in some ways, is anointed. On the other hand, if he loses, he becomes a loose cannon. And as John McGinnis just said in that conversation, he may very well decide to run as a third-party independent candidate. As a George Wallace-type candidate.
But not as a Republican?
I think he could run as an independent. I think that may be some of his allies have been out checking out how do you get on the ballot in places like California as a third-party candidate.
They're already checking.
They've already been checking that out, and I don't think he'd get many votes. But the fact is that in a close election, if he got 3 to 5% of the vote, he could cost George Bush the election.
I think the fear for George Bush has to be, who's in a free fall this week politically, has to be that David Duke would run against him in Republican primaries. David Duke has, first of all, robbed George Bush of an issue. He's made the quota affirmative action issue radioactive politically. George Bush can't go near it. Because it immediately he's now talking out of the playbook and the choir book of David Duke. So the re-election campaign theme of crime, quotas, and Kuwait is gone. So that's the first problem he presents to him. And the second problem, I think David's absolutely right. In a way, 49% frees him. It gives him a respectability if he gets 49% on Saturday. to emerge. This is a man who can charge legitimately of press overkill. I mean, he has been the sole issue in this campaign. There has been a media overkill on David Duke. I mean, there's nobody...
What do you mean a media overkill?
There's nobody, Judy, in a non-comatose state who's not aware of the fact right now that David Duke slept under a swastika, went to Heinrich Himmler's birthday party.
You're saying there's been too much press coverage.
I mean, I have no idea. Edwin Edwards, when he was governor of Louisiana, was one of the 2 or 3 smartest governors in the country, maybe the smartest. I mean, but no one has an idea what he's going to do as governor. Nobody covers him. He has one event a day.
Can I disagree with that
okay,
for a second?
Sure.
I think we have not given enough attention to Edwin Edwards, and the best that could be said about him by some of his supporters, Times-Picayune editorial endorsing him, saying at least he's an honest crook. But on David Duke, it seems to me that David Duke has tried to present himself as a born-again everything. Christian, everything else he believes in, and the media has a responsibility in those circumstances to expose the man. The fact is, his conversion has been at the 11th hour. Only, 3 years ago, he was espousing neo-Nazi.
Do you think anybody doesn't know that? I mean, is there anybody?
But you think there should have been less coverage?
I think at some point, I ought to have an idea of what the next governor is going to do. I mean, a good friend of mine from Louisiana said, and Edwin Edwards was always, when we're told about David Duke, Edwin, who's a notorious skirt chaser, now he says he's retired and reformed himself, said, well, they used to say I was a wizard under the sheets as well. and Edwin Edwards is somebody who, a friend of mine from Louisiana described, having Edwin Edwards for governor was like having a drunk for a daddy. It's funny to everybody else in town, but it's kind of tough on you. And I don't think there's been the kind of attention given to Edwin Edwards in this campaign that there should have been.
But I would say this. I think that Duke is forcing us to look deep into our souls as a country and say, is this what our politics is coming to? And that's a healthy thing. And I think the fact is, you're right about the quota issues become radioactive, and maybe we're going to have a more honest discussion about race and race relations in the next campaign, and that would be healthy for everybody.
Well, speaking of problems for the president, and Mark, you just said he was in a free fall. I gather you mean in the polls and other fronts this week. He also has another challenge, apparently. He may have somebody challenging him for the Republican nomination, namely Pat Buchanan, the television commentator. Is that something for George Bush to be worrying about at this point?
Sure. George Bush right now is faced this week with the prospect of having to run to the left of David Duke and to the right of Pat Buchanan. And now I don't know how he's going to do that. I mean, he's got 2 potential primary challenges. Pat Buchanan is a serious person. He's never held office before. But he's willing, apparently, to forego a very prominent position. Worked in the Nixon White House. Was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. Was communications director. Succeeded my good friend to the left here in the Reagan White House as communications director in the 2nd term. But he represents a conservative movement I'm not sure is still there. I'm not sure it's still there in the sense that Ronald Reagan embodied that conservative movement. I think an awful lot of conservatives believe what was achievable, Ronald Reagan achieved. What wasn't achievable, Ronald Reagan tried to do, whether it was school prayer or abortion or whatever. And Pat is, I think, going to find out that probably the anti-communism, which was the glue that held that conservative movement, is gone. And I think that add to that the fact that the religious right has sustained when Jimmy Swaggart and Reverend Jim Baker some really serious body blows.
But David, there's a lot of talk, though, about what Pat Buchanan could do in New Hampshire, which is, after all, the 2nd presidential contest next February.
I think that it's no question that Pat Buchanan can be much more than an irritant to the White House. And we should say both of us are friends of Pat and our colleagues and that sort of thing. It seems to me that or conservatives tell me that they think he can get 25 to 30% of the vote in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has been very hard hit by the recession, and there are a lot of conservatives. Mark, I think the conservative movement was declining. I think it's on the rise again. There's a new wave of it, and they feel very strongly, the conservatives do, that the president has capitulated to the left on one issue after another, starting with the increase in taxes that he signed on to a year ago, on the quotas, on more regulation on government, and they see Pat Buchanan as someone not only can be a voice of protest, but can put pressure on the president to pull back to the right, because this White House has a history of essentially listening to pressure and then responding to it. So you're saying he's got a potential
national constituency, not just people who are frustrated about the economy in New Hampshire.
I think he can cause real problems in New Hampshire.
There's two points. One, I think David is right on the fact that there's a sense of a conviction deficit in the Bush administration. I mean, if there's pressure applied, they respond and they react. There's no doubt about that. But I have to come back to the fact that George Bush is seen by conservatives. It's not an agenda item. It's a visceral. They see that he's not one of them. He really doesn't believe what they believe. He's never been there. He presented himself in 1988 as a Republican nominee as sort of Tonto to the Lone Ranger of Ronald Reagan. I mean, that he had been loyal, faithful, but not that he really shared those same convictions and passions that Reagan. Pat does. Pat is a passionate, true believer, and it's what you see is what you get with Pat Buchanan.
What the administration, what the president's going to have to do is sit down and figure out what he really stands for and hold tight. I mean, he's done two things in the last few days, which I think people have just been stunned by.
You don't think he's figured that out by now?
Well, Judy, just in the last few days, what have we had? He called for reducing the credit card rates from 18% down to 14%. The Congress said, let's go along with this. And what do we have today? The stock market dropped 120 points. You know, Washington, if it can't do well, should at least try to do no harm.
Well, David Gergen, Mark Shields, we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, the main stories of this Friday. The stock market suffered its fifth biggest loss ever, dropping more than 120 points. The Senate tonight passed a $5.3 billion bill to extend unemployment benefits and sent it to the president. The Iran-Contra conviction of former National Security Advisor John Poindexter was overturned, and former Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams was given probation for his role in the scandal. Good night, Judy.
Good night, Robin. That's our news hour for tonight. We'll be back Monday night with analysis of the results of the Louisiana governor's race and an interview with White House Chief of Staff John Sununu. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you and have a good weekend.
Funding for the News Hour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour since 1983 because quality information and quality communication is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you. Video cassettes of the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.